Hello and welcome to Critical Readings, episode 335 for the 10th of August, 2026. I'm Dr. Sean Philip Cooper, and with me today I have Dr. Drew Nathaniel Keene.
Salutations.
And Lane Haygood.
Hello.
Hello, gentlemen. It's the final episode on the Ill-MadeKnight from The Once and Future King by T.H. White this week. And then we'll move to the denouement, the final episode of the tetralogy, the final episode, which for us will be several episodes starting next week. But this week we're going to finish up the Ill-MadeKnight. And last week we had Lancelot's madness, we had the Holy Grail sequence, and we had the death of Elaine. And I somehow got jumbled up. And I said last week that the death of Elaine came earlier. I don't know how I managed this. Apparently, at some point, I put down my book and picked it up and began reading later on, then sat it down and picked it up and went back to where I was, because this week reading it, I ran across the death of Elaine again. I'm like, okay, how could there be two deaths of Elaine? She's not a vampire. She doesn't keep rising again to torment Lancelot. So, of course, I looked in my book and there's only the one in chapter 40. So something's gone terribly wrong in my reading. But I fixed it this week. And we will talk a little bit about the death of Elaine and the end of the Ill-MadeKnight, which I think is really, it had to have been designed to lead into The Candle in the Wind, because the way that it ends is such a non-ending, really. It's just a bridge. So we'll talk a little bit about why White might have decided to do that and what he was thinking. And then we'll begin next week, The Candle in the Wind. Now, Elaine and
you
I
had told us before,
Go ahead.
Regarding Elaine's death, that it might have been relocated from where it was when this was a standalone novel, The Ill-MadeKnight,
No.
to when it was.
And
so that's not
it's
that's
the
not
case.
correct.
It seems always to have been here. It's just that I
Okay.
picked up my standalone novel and read in a different place than I was reading in the tetralogy. And I shouldn't do that. I shouldn't be reading from two different versions, I know. But it's gotten us into trouble once on this series already when I was reading from the original version of The Sword and the Stone. But it is, in my defense, a good deal more convenient to carry the individual volumes around than the big honkin' tetralogy version, this is a big book. So,
Yeah.
But I've been duly corrected. I will only read from the tetralogy now. I'll lock away my other books. Okay, well, what of the end of the Ill-MadeKnight? No comments this week, by the way, so we have nothing to read. But we will read comments in 2 more weeks, if there are any takers, in 337. So let's get to it. Well, what about Lancelot? Last week, Drew, you were telling us, I think it was last week or the week before perhaps, you were telling us how much you dislike Lancelot. So I've gone out of my way to choose attractive Lancelots for the most recent 2 podcast episodes. We got Ewan Griffiths in one role, and then I don't remember the name of the actor on the BBC Merlin series, but they're both attractive hirsute men. They've got beards. They look a bit like Lane, actually. So Lane could stand in for Lancelot.
So no.
The beard, that's a good question, right? Whenever I read these books, I never think of the characters as having beards, because surely no civilized man would have a beard. And yet, of course, we are told by Mallory that one of the complaints they have about young Arthur is that he's a beardless boy who has won no battles. And so, of course, later on, he must grow a beard. And Lancelot, he's a Frenchman. He would have a nice pointy beard in all likelihood.
Why I don't understand why you haven't used Richard Gere as one of our images.
I did use Richard Gere. Don't worry.
Okay,
Oh yes,
good.
He was in part 8. Richard Gere was 332.
Surely the best Lancelot to ever grace the screen.
No. Suffice to say, no. Santiago Cabrera was a good Lancelot. He was the Lancelot in the BBC's Merlin series. But the Lancelot in that series is very different from the Lancelot that we know. He's like itinerant, and he's only at the court a couple times. Guinevere does.
I would like it better that way.
Yeah. Guinevere does fall in love with him, but he's also not the son of a king. He's a commoner, which really stands the Arthurian mythos on its head, because of course the reason all of these knights are so good at being knights is that they're all actually noble. And there's a certain truth to that. I mean, you couldn't spend your life practicing being a knight if you weren't noble, because it's expensive and requires a good deal of support. But, this is not the reason why in the books. This is not the reason why. It's not because they have lots of support. It's just because they're noble. Noble blood
It's their
coursing through their
genetic
veins.
inheritance to
Exactly.
be great at arms.
It's inherited. That's all. Well, in any case, what's going on with Lancelot in the end here? Holy Grail's come. He's come back. He's got his god. Jenny goes quite mad.
I wish that some filmmaker would be brave enough to give us an ugly Lancelot, as T.H. White has done here.
Well, as we'll find out next week, that ugliness eventually becomes a sort of strength and dependability. It's like it's reassuring in a way, right? Reassuring ugliness, because he's like White compares him to a bulldog. He's like a bulldog, right? But I still wonder about the ugliness. I go back to his childhood. You don't meet many ugly children. Children aren't really ugly. They might be out of shape.
I beg to differ. I've seen plenty of ugly children.
Oh, Drew. Shame. For
And
shame.
ugly babies.
Ugly babies. No, babies are delightful. There are no ugly babies. Like I said, you could have out of shape children. You could have fat children, right? But I think that all children are just basically pleasant, because they're full of joy and there's a sort of cherubic quality to them. They haven't quite gone lanky and made themselves uglier, which is what people do, I suppose.
It's cherubic is an interesting analogy, since the cherubs are supposed to be absolutely terrifying.
Well, yeah, the real ones, yes, they're horrified. Don't look at them. They've got all sorts of eyes and wings and
yes,
unpleasant. I like the little Renaissance cherubs, Drew. That's what I'm thinking of. The ones with little wings on and harps and bows and All right. Well, in any case, I struggle to believe. I mean, White says he's more oblique about Lancelot's ugliness as a child, because the only impression we get of it is from that upturned helmet that he's looking in. I mean, Merlin never says anything, and neither does Nimue, and neither do his parents, and neither do any of the other people. It's only when he goes off to court and he's sort of a grown-up that people start talking about him being ugly. But that's years later. So I think White's giving us another psychological lesson, which he does love to do, and telling us, this little boy thought he was ugly, and then he made himself ugly. Made himself really ugly. Well, in any case, there's an ugliness inside of him, and this is, I was going to say cured. It's probably not the right word. It's absolved. That's what it is. It's absolved. Because he goes to a priest, as we found out last week, and he gets shriven, and Guinevere is all fretty and rubbing her hands together. Did you confess all of your sins? He's like, yes, even. And they're like, no, you don't need to tell us. Not because we know, but because that's for the priest. That's why. So.
But Arthur also then, I think, to smooth over the situation, gives the implication that they all were thinking about Elaine.
Oh, yes.
Of course, they all know that they weren't thinking about that.
That's right. Exactly. It was Elaine. Oh, Elaine? No need to bring Elaine into this. So it's clear then that he's been absolved of his adulterous liaison. And as long as he doesn't do it again, he'll stay clean. And he can maybe even do miracles again. And in fact, he will do a miracle this week. Because in this week's episode, we get the closing scenes of everything up to the final sequence of Mallory's Morte d'Arthur. So there are 2 or 3 little scenes. And if you remember our Mallory episode, you'll remember the tournament at Westminster, and you'll remember the night of the cart, and you'll remember the poisoned apple. So this week, we're going to look at the poisoned apple and the night of the cart. Well, the first thing is the poisoned apple. And this is where Sir Bors, who is, some people say, defamed as the misogynist by T.H. White. And I've been thinking about this over the week since I think it was Mao who raised this topic. It's really unfair of White to call Bors a misogynist. But let's remember that the way that Bors proved his mettle in the Holy Grail sequence is he was willing to condemn all those beautiful maidens in the castle. Remember? Well, what if they're all thrown off the castle to their death? Is that worth your virtue? And Bors said, yes. So all the maidens threw themselves off the castle, but they turned out to be demons, so they weren't really women at all. But maybe that's why he gets the title, right? Because he was willing. He was unmoved by their beauty and their entreaties, and he was more protective of his own virtue.
Oh, wicked zoot.
Go ahead. What?
I was quoting Monty Python of the Holy Grail. Oh, wicked zoot.
Indeed.
I could stand a little peril.
Just a little peril. So let's have a little. No, the peril is too perilous. Indeed.
It's a bit rich for me when White calls anyone a misogynist. Especially in chapter 15, where he says, but unfortunately he was a misogynist, and like most people of that sort, he had the female failing of indiscretion. Misogyny in the very sentence where you're accusing someone of it.
Well, I think that we must accept that this is where Bors gets the title from. And also he has a particular dislike for Guinevere, which isn't misogyny. I think it's just he doesn't like her. And he shouldn't like her because she's a rather nasty piece of work in many ways.
Well, and it's not that he's unique in not liking her.
A lot of people in the court.
We get the impression that aside from Arthur and Lancelot, nobody in the court much likes her.
It is often the way, isn't it? Right? Nobody likes the boss's girlfriend. And that there's that sort of attitude especially to male-centric cliques, which is what the Round Table is. It's all men, right? All men, all the time. It's like when Lane will understand this. You're in a raid group, right? And WoW, and everyone there is a guy, except the raid leader's brought his girlfriend, and she's going to be your healer this week. And you just know you're going to die a lot. That's what that means. And so you don't like her. You don't like her. And I think that that's kind of what's going on here. White, long before WoW laid these things bare, has made an essential truth of the human psyche to us. It's that in a group of men, if one man, and only one man, and it's the guy who's in charge, has his wife along, nobody likes her. She's going to have a rough time of it. And that's what's going on for Guinevere. But also, she's an adulteress, and her husband doesn't deserve that. Although, as we see in The Candle in the Wind, Mallory weaves back in something that he's left out, which is Arthur trying to kill Mordred at Merlin's behest, which is something from Mallory. But other than that, it's hard to say that Arthur deserves what's being done to him. So one doesn't like Guinevere. And one probably shouldn't like Lancelot. But then there's the double standard of human behavior, right? Young men are just sowing their oats. They're just doing what it is they do. But women, if they do it, they're soiled, right? So that's rather unfair. Well, what about... go ahead. Both of you at once, simultaneously.
Go ahead, Lane.
I say we do get the most interiority of Guinevere in the first couple chapters, 34, 35. Finally, White comes in and tells us, yes, she was good and bad. She was not all of one thing. She was complex. And so he does give her a little bit of vindication here that she's not as bad as portrayed. She's just a human being with human failings, but also human virtues.
Yeah, she's a real person, right? White likes that phrase, a real person, not an allegorical model or a didactic framing device. I'm going to fix my camera here. Just a real person. So she makes mistakes, and she has failings as well as virtues.
I do think that in some ways she is the most free character, in the sense that she's not a stand-in for a certain idea that White wants to convey. You know, Arthur sometimes doesn't feel like a real character in The Once and Future King. Merlin sometimes doesn't feel like a real character, right? They serve a certain function. But Guinevere seems a little bit more rounded as a character, a little bit freer.
No, I think that's right. Absolutely. And so, in a way, I mean, although it's not in many ways the most flattering portrayal of Guinevere, I think it's probably one of the best, because it does try to portray her as a real person and not just as a, you know, as you say, an allegorical model for something else.
Or as just a prop for the male characters. I mean, I think up until this time, this is probably the most fleshed out human Guinevere that literature has. I think that it's been surpassed since then.
Yeah.
But
it's one of the most fleshed out characters in the book, too, as you rightly point out, right? Which is probably the greatest compliment White could pay her. He makes her completely believable in a way that all the people around her are not. If you ran into the other characters in the real world, you might be perplexed by their, you know, single-mindedness or their two-dimensionality. But not her. You would recognize her anywhere in the real world. Yeah. Which is why I think she goes a bit mad, because people who are driven to great emotional extremes do go a bit mad. And she does go a bit mad. And she goes, if you've ever been in a fight with your female partner, a really proper screaming match, then you'll recognize a good deal of what happens with Guinevere, which is why I think White must have had a girlfriend at some point, and they must have had some proper arguments, because she does go a bit off the rails there.
I think I've read that he also had a very rocky relationship with his mother, which might feed into this a bit too.
I think he had a very unhappy childhood, is the sense I got. His mother was very demanding. And when you think about his portrayal of Morgause, it's hard to imagine that coming out of a place of ignorance, right? I mean, there must be some truth to his experience of childhood parenting to what Morgause gives us, because it's not something you would just invent, I think. And he even gets the effect of it down pat, as we see with Agravain and Mordred.
Well, he was personally seeing a psychoanalyst. Mm-hmm. And so he did have a lot of the firsthand experience of that, you know, childhood traumas lead to adult dysfunctions.
Well, you know, there's, writ large, there's probably a good deal of truth to that. We don't need to necessarily buy into all the Freudian details, but...
So his knowledge of Freudian psychoanalysis was not just from books, but also from his firsthand experience of being
on the couch.
Yeah.
Yes.
All right.
Interesting.
Well, last week I told you I didn't like Guinevere. I still don't like Guinevere. And the reason I don't like Guinevere is best summed up in the chapter where she does go a bit crazy and she starts screaming at Lancelot. Are we there yet? No, does that come later? I can't even remember where it is now.
What chapter are we starting with this time?
34.
34. Okay.
So Elaine is still alive. My bookmark is at 36. Why did I do that? No, it is in fact 34. This is about the tragedy of Guinevere. Guinevere's central tragedy was that she was childless. Arthur had 2 illegitimate children, and Lancelot had Galahad, but Guinevere, and she was the one of the 3 who most ought to have had children, and who would have been best with children, and whom God had seemingly made for breeding lovely children. She was the one who was left an empty vessel, a shore without a sea. This was what broke her when she came to the age at which her sea must finally dry. It is what turned her for a little time into a raving woman, though that time was still in the future. It may be one of the explanations of her double love. Perhaps she loved Arthur as a father and Lancelot because of the son she could not have.
Yes, I remember being so deeply uncomfortable when I read that paragraph. Where to begin? The breeding word struck me as odd. The the Lancelot as child, Arthur as father, so neither one of them actually
Oh no,
has this
Lancelot
kind of.
has a son, right? And so she
No,
loves.
but at the end it says, will you read that last sentence again?
Sure, it says.
Yeah, the last one is just pure Freud.
Yeah.
Let's see. Perhaps she loved Arthur as a father and Lancelot because of the son she could not have.
So Lancelot is like a stand-in for her
No,
son.
I think it's
It's
because
like a
Lancelot
stand-in
has
for her
Galahad.
father.
That was the mention. So earlier in that paragraph, she says, or he says, excuse me, Arthur had 2 illegitimate children and Lancelot had Galahad. And so that was my reading, is that
Oh,
it doesn't say that
I
she
read
loved.
it. I read it in Drew's way. This
Oh,
is Oedipus.
no, that's too weird for me. I refuse to read it that way.
But I think that's what it means.
No, I don't. I refuse. I will not be moved. It's because it says she Lancelot is the son, so that's what it means.
But also this picture of, a woman who hasn't had a child as an empty vessel, as if your life doesn't matter if it's not reproductive in a biological sense. It would be one thing if it was presented as this is how Guinevere feels about herself. It's that it's presented straightforwardly by the narrator as if this is the way of things that I find so jarring.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think that Guinevere's feelings are very common, right? There's nothing unusual about them. We have to be careful with White that, he's reflecting the position of his time and making this feeling into a truth. And
You sometimes can't tell if his narrator is describing the way a character feels or simply describing the way things are.
yes,
He's not always clear to distinguish those.
So let's be charitable to him and say he's describing how she feels. That's easier for us too, because certainly a person's value doesn't come from whether they have children or not. But a lot of people, for probably very strong biological reasons, do feel that way. And Guinevere, who never has children, and being a character in the book, she can be made to feel, in response to that, how people naturally are, feels bereft.
Well, and it would make sense in a society in which primogeniture matters.
Oh, yeah.
The duty of the queen is to produce an heir. So,
yeah, well, that's the important. That's what makes the treason dangerous, right? The reason that sleeping with the king's wife is dangerous is because it calls into doubt any issue from the marriage or from the relationship. Is the child of the queen really the king's son, or is it somebody else's? A cuckoo in the nest, and that's why it was treason to engage in such things. Although in Guinevere's case, it doesn't seem really to matter, which adds a whole new dimension to this.
It's the reason for the entire disparity in attitudes towards male and female promiscuity.
Mm-hmm.
It's fine for men to spread their seed wherever, but we need to be sure who someone's father is, and therefore the woman can only have one sexual partner, because if she has more than one, then we don't know who's the father, and
who
to
will
this whole
inherit.
system, that's the biggest problem.
Indeed, you don't want to pass on the family possessions and power to someone who isn't of the male bloodline. All right, so there is a mention there that in the future she will be a raving woman. So it isn't something we've read before. It is something that's coming this week. I thought so. Because she becomes hysterical, and I want to read it when we find it and get to it. Because she attacks him on the grounds that I said last week I didn't like her, which is that Guinevere doesn't want any competition. She doesn't want to compete against Elaine, and is convinced in her mind, although she must know it's not true, is convinced in her mind that Lancelot loves Elaine and, doesn't likes Elaine even more than her. It's nonsense, right? And then when Elaine is finally out of the picture, as we see this week in chapter 40, she remonstrates with Lancelot for not spending more time with Elaine, which is the kind of thing that she could only do if Elaine were dead. Does that make sense?
Well, as soon as she sees Elaine dead, a totally new response emerges or surfaces that she hasn't had before, which is one of great pity for Elaine's situation. But while Elaine is still an active rival in Guinevere's mind, not that she's really a rival from Lancelot's point of view, she's not able to feel that pity. It's only once she's gone that she's free enough to feel it.
Well, and there's one of my central condemnations of Guinevere. Is it really pity? I mean it is really pity, but it's pity with it's all sorts of conditions around it, right? I can't actually feel pity for you because you're still alive and you're a rival to me, is a very different kind of pity than actually Elaine's state from the beginning is pitiable. And although she does sort of rape Lancelot, that doesn't diminish the fact that her state is a pitiable one. She's being boiled in a vat her entire life. And Lancelot finally comes along to her, and she's completely faithful to him.
I wouldn't put it, though, in the sense of Guinevere has put conditions around her pity. I would simply say that her feelings of jealousy are so intense that even though under normal circumstances she might feel pity for someone in that situation, the jealousy itself makes it impossible for that to emerge.
Isn't that
once the jealousy is gone, then suddenly those feelings emerge.
Like, that's the condition, though, isn't it? I mean, the condition is
but it's not a consciously chosen.
Yes.
condition.
No, it isn't. It isn't consciously chosen. You're absolutely right. And that's, am I wrong to think of that as a character failing? I mean, just because it's unconscious doesn't free her of, turpitude in possessing this condition.
No, it doesn't. It doesn't excuse it from being ugly, but it does make it very human. And this is back to that point I made before, which is that she's the most human character in this. I mean, that's very believable.
Mm-hmm. No, it is. But I'd like her to be better,
superhuman,
virtuous, to have pity for someone even if they're a rival.
You want her to be a saint. She's not a saint.
I don't want her to be a saint. I just want her to look at Elaine and say, look, she won Lancelot. Guinevere, what? She has him. He's there. He's in Camelot. He came back to her. And
you want a bit of growth.
Yeah, just something that isn't adolescent. And, the thing with Guinevere is she always feels vaguely adolescent to me. And if the lack of pity and understanding for Elaine's situation isn't enough, I was totally on side when Elaine said, what's wrong with you? You have Arthur. You have the best knight in the world. And why can't you have to have Lancelot too? It's then the needing to set herself up as a rival to God and being angry that Lancelot loves God more than her. And
I think the perpetual adolescence is, I think you put your finger on it. She is stuck there, but she's also stuck there because of the kind of culture that they inhabit infantilizes women. I mean, she's not allowed to be a fully rational human being in the way that a man is, right? Chivalry infantilizes. It treats the woman like a child. So she's sort of responding to the incentives of the chivalric system.
That's fair, I suppose. But I still don't like her. I mean, break out of the system. Grow. Just have. She goes to church. What's being said in the sermons? Love your enemies.
Sermons were not. Sermons were usually only heard by the nobility during Lent as a kind of discipline.
That's what's going on.
Sermons were not an invariable part of the Mass.
Pipping out early is what's going on. Well, in any case, she gets she gets Lancelot, and Elaine doesn't. And in the early chapters of this week's reading, chapter 34, when she's completely, made up with him, really, she looks at him and he's being washed and she's smiling. And then we see in chapter 35 that Lancelot kept faith with his divinity for a week or a month, and that would have been fine, but it's not, because he seems to go on wishing to be true to his divinity. And for someone who had been in proximity to the Holy Grail and had been blown back from the door, I mean, Lancelot has had proof, physical proof, indisputable proof of the existence of the Christian God. I want to make that very clear to people. This is not that Lancelot's faith no longer has to be purely faith. Right? He's had experiential evidence. I mean, Galahad's been assumed into heaven by singing choirs of angels with the Holy Grail. They found it. I mean, they found God. And if you knew, I don't mean if you believed, like very strongly, if you knew categorically that God existed, it might change you. Now, the Israelites knew categorically that God existed too, and he traveled around with them in a pillar of flame by night and a pillar of smoke by day, and they still made golden idols and worshiped them. But you would think that it would have an effect on Lancelot, and it does. He doesn't want to go back to his adulterous liaison with Guinevere. He doesn't want to hurt her or harm her, but I think he expects her to understand. And what's really weird is that she doesn't. And maybe this is the infantilization you talk about, Drew, or maybe, like I think, it's just that she's incapable of getting out. She can't grow beyond what she is. I mean, doesn't she think?
But you see, that's what infantilizing someone does to them. When you infantilize someone, you are creating a situation in which someone can't grow, in which you're discouraging any kind of growth. This is sort of where you ought to stay. Let us take care of you. The business about God, and I can't find exactly where the paragraph is, but there's something quite interesting about where Lancelot's understanding of God is described.
Oh, yes. Yeah, where he basically when he was a child.
Well, and that God is for him a real person.
Yeah.
In the sense that Guinevere and Arthur are. Not an idea, not a concept, not an abstraction, but a real person, which is part of why, because the way that Lancelot's able to talk about God as if a real person that he has real affection for is part of why it incites Guinevere's jealousy in the way that any other human person would.
Oh, it's in 37.
Insight. That's really good. Yeah, we've that's from a previous week, but you're absolutely right. And I hadn't thought of that. So that Guinevere is picking up on something, and she realizes that from the way Lancelot carries on, God is a real person and therefore a real rival. And he is. Right. I mean, he is a rival for her because her affections are sinful. And if you love God, then you will avoid sin, and that means avoiding Guinevere.
Yeah, but see, that's not the kind of attitude that Guinevere has about Lancelot's God. It's not, your God makes this bad, and I think it's good. It's not, your God's law condemns me. It's, you love this person, and you should only love me.
That's it. And that's why I don't like her. Right there. Because, I mean, that's satanic. In the literal sense, right? I mean, I want to replace God with myself. And it makes me,
Oh, here it is. Here it is.
Oh,
this is a paragraph worth reading. And it is in 37, which is in our reading
it is,
this
yeah,
week,
30. Yeah, okay. Well, how did that happen?
The Ill-MadeKnight was not involved in an eternal triangle. It was an eternal quadrangle, which was eternal as well as quadrangular. He had not given up his mistress because he was afraid of being punished by some sort of holy bogey, but he had been confronted by two people whom he loved. The one was Arthur's queen, the other a wordless presence who had celebrated Mass at Castle Carbonek. Unfortunately, as so often happens in love affairs, the two subjects of his affection were contradictory. It was almost as if he had been confronted with a choice between Jane and Janet, and as if he had gone to Janet not because he was afraid that she would punish him if he stayed with Jane, but because he felt with warmth and pity that he loved her best. He may even have felt that God needed him more than Guinevere did. This was the problem, an emotional rather than a moral one, which had taken him into retreat at his abbey, where he had hoped to feel things out. You see what I mean?
Yes.
So that goes very much into Lancelot's interiority and talks about almost like White knew what it was like to carry on an affair. And so I had to look at his biography, and he never did. He never had a love affair. But he describes it so perfectly here that I was wondering how he could come to that. And what his biographer felt was that this was him working through his own confused feelings on his sexuality, for which he went into psychoanalysis.
So his view of God, when I say seeing God as a real person, that makes God on a parity with Guinevere, right? It's as if it's Jane and Janet, and which one do I love more? So it's a very sort of anthropic view of God rather than a theological view.
Well, and an emotional one too, right? Which is
Yeah.
what White points out, that this is an emotional reaction. It's not that Lancelot was a theologian, which is where I guess maybe my objection to this comes from. I'm seminary trained. And so the idea that someone would love something more than God offends me on all sorts of theological and philosophical levels. I don't think it does for Lancelot, right? Lancelot's not sitting down, working out the theological reasons why it's important. It's just that he really loves God.
Well, and he's, as far as theology goes, he says things as something that's almost blasphemous. He said, I felt that God needed me more.
Yeah.
Than if you does.
I mean, God
He's a
doesn't need anything.
Right.
He's perfect in and of
And
himself.
they're not distinguishing here between like eros or agape or other forms of love. Like,
No,
there's
it's
no reason for
romance.
Guinevere to be jealous of love for God, because it's not the same thing as love for a person. And if it is, you're seriously confused.
Well, maybe that's the problem, is that for Lancelot, it verges on to being that kind of love, right?
It doesn't verge on. It is that
It
kind
is.
of.
It is. Yes.
right. So Guinevere, I don't want to say it's right
The
for
instincts
her.
that have been generated in Guinevere of jealousy are legitimate because of the way Lancelot feels about God.
Legitimate, but not
it's
right.
the same romance.
Legitimate, but not right. I think legitimate is the right word.
Explicable. Let's put it that way.
Explicable. That's the word we need. They make sense, but they're still wrong. And Guinevere is still bad. I'm with Sir Bors on this. And I think I would be like Bors if I were in the court, and she came to me and is like, nobody else will be my champion. I'm like, oh, jeez, oh man. But she's the king's wife. So what do you do? All right. If nobody else, have you asked everybody? If nobody else can be found, then I suppose I'll do it. And that's what Bors
I think
does.
we need to talk about that too. This trial by combat business, and the new idea that White says Arthur is developing. This is in the third paragraph of chapter 37. For a new idea had begun to form in the king's mind. The effort to dig a channel for might had failed, even when it was turned to the spirit, and now he was feeling his way towards abolishing it. He had decided not to truckle with might anymore, to cut it out, root and branch, by establishing another standard altogether. He was groping towards right as a criterion of its own, towards justice as an abstract thing which did not lean upon power. In a few years, he would be inventing civil law. This is just pure liberal claptrap of the
No,
worst
the
kind.
Romans didn't invent civil law. Arthur did.
Right.
Oh,
And you can have justice as an abstract thing that doesn't rest upon power. No, I mean, it's the threat of force is what makes the law legal.
yes.
Foucault has entered the chat. So I do want to say something about this, because if we start thinking, if we think of this in narrower terms than White uses, talk about like the rise of the English common law, which I think is kind of what he's actually getting at here, which is a real historical development. First, that mainly arises under Henry II. And let's remember why it arises. It doesn't arise because of some particular virtue on the part of Henry II that makes him value justice. Wouldn't that be nice?
Which is why it's not invented. It's not
Because his
invented.
nobleman threatened to kill him if he didn't.
Yes. Well, it's more than that. Even that I think wouldn't have worked. The real reason it arises is the convenience of the king. Henry II can't be everywhere, but the king needs to do justice, and he wants to spend a good deal of his time in France as well as in England. How are you going to be everywhere and do justice? Well, what if the law doesn't just mean, here's what the king says on a given day? What if the law also means, here's what my judges have to say? So if we start letting the judges hear the cases, that suggests that their justice is as good as the king's. It means that the justice can flow from the king to the judges. It means, in fact, that justice is something completely separate from the king. And once you start having judges that can hear cases, then you don't really need the king at all, if the judges have access to justice. And so this is how the common law begins to develop, just because it's more convenient for the king, and it's more convenient for the distribution of his will, which is at once identified with justice and then no longer. So it isn't a nice gift that someone invents. It's actually just the complete convenience of the monarch that slowly becomes separated from his person over time, which is a very different thing.
See, I think that that's not even what White really has in mind here. I think that what he has in mind here is a 17th century concept of law in place of customary rights. Because that's the first time in English history that statute law is being used to overturn customary rights, particularly the rights of tenants, that they didn't have any deeds, they didn't have any documentation, but they had their customary rights. And the landlords at this point are starting to use the law to overturn the concept of custom. I think is more what White has in mind here when he talks about the law.
That's even meaner.
Which makes it even more anachronistic.
Yeah.
As civil law in terms of the civil courts, private rights of action, going to court to enforce the things between people, not necessarily between sovereign and subject.
Right.
Well, there you go. So Arthur's creation of the law is this noble philosophical abstraction. The real life creation of civil law is actually bound up with personal interest, and it's not noble at all. It's actually grasping and avaricious and a matter of convenience for the monarch.
Right. It was not invented by a philosopher king, which is what this is the picture we're being given here.
Exactly.
It was invented by grasping merchants.
Exactly.
Who wanted to take power from the nobility.
Now, of course, this is a piece of fiction, and White will spend a good deal of time, I think at the beginning of The Candle in the Wind, reminding us of that when he gives us his potted history of ordinary people and what life was like under the kings of the era, which is to say nasty and brutal and unpleasant. Okay, so it's Lancelot who eventually steps in, right? Bors doesn't have to defend the queen in the episode of the poisoned apple. I actually like White's telling of the poisoned apple episode a good deal better than Mallory because it has the virtue of being brief, and Mallory kind of spends it rather too long on it because what is actually the pith of the episode is really actually very small. That there's a sort of a vendetta against Gawain, and one of the other knights tries to poison him, and Guinevere gets blamed for it because she bought the apples, basically. And
White has a very convenient trick for when he doesn't want something to take a lot of time. He'll say, look, if you want to read more about this, go to Mallory.
Go to Mallory. If you want to read about the Holy Grail, you want to know about that story, it can only be told that way once, and Mallory's already done it. And so go read it there. And I think that a lot of that is fair because, as I think White points out somewhere, Mallory has a particular gift for writing down the battles. I think it's when he's describing the tournament at Westminster, right? He says, you can get every knight's score because Mallory tracks it very carefully. He's very concerned about that sort of thing, as he would be. For Mallory, the most important virtue is prowess. So what could be more important than tracking the results of prowess? I mean, he's like a cricket fan. He's obsessed with those sorts of details. And if you're a cricket fan, then you're obsessed with them too. I am. I want to know who scored what. I want to know how they got out. I want to know what everybody's averages are. I completely understand. I'm with Mallory in that. But a lot of readers aren't interested in that. And so White kind of glosses over it and gives you the highlights. And it does make for a punchier story, especially with the poisoned apple, which, as I say, the pith of the story is quite small.
White has his equivalent to Mallory's interest in martial skill. Mallory is very interested in martial skill. He's good at describing martial skill. And White's not good at that, but he's good at something that Mallory isn't good at, which is describing the inner torment of love.
Oh, absolutely.
He's all about that.
Mallory's totally uninterested. He'll say it in a sentence, the queen was distract. And that's it. That's all there is. Okay, well, and yet that still is better than many of the contemporary accounts of how Guinevere feels, because at least it mentions that she has feelings. They're not, they don't just exist in a world of pure action, which when you read a lot of the Arthurian foundational texts, that's what it is. It's record. There's a reason that P.J.C. Field called the Morte d'Arthur romance and chronicle. It's that chronicle tradition that Arthurian literature comes out of that makes it often feel action-centric and very poor in psychology and psychological motivation. This has led some people to believe that, well, the medievals didn't think about why people did anything. They had no interiority. You've probably heard that, Drew, right? Medieval people had no interiority. It's nonsense. Of course, people read the Cloud of Unknowing, read the Book of Marjorie Kemp. People were constantly thinking inside of themselves. But a lot of the romance tradition comes out of the chronicle tradition, and the chronicle tradition was a third-person record of events. So coming out of that tradition, developing out of it, it's just a list of what happened. And then that becomes a list of what people did, but still not why or what they were thinking. That required invention. And the writers of the time, perhaps in a misguided way, felt that inventing motivations for people was just a bridge too far, right? I mean, there's a kind of a lie to it. Recording what they did, well, you can do that completely truthfully. Arthur did this and Arthur did that. But if you start to speculate about what he might have been thinking, why he might have done something, well, now you're not in the business of writing down the truth anymore. You're writing fiction.
Yeah, and I think that there are some material contextual reasons for why some things warrant the expense of producing a written record and other things don't. It's that it is very expensive to produce a written document, right? It's not like you just have paper lying around freely for anybody to use whenever they want. And most people couldn't read or write. It's a very elite activity. And so, of course, the things that get written are much more public-facing events rather than personal thoughts. It's not they didn't have interior lives. It's that that's just not what you spend the expense of writing on.
Absolutely. Well, let's return to the text, if we might, with all this firmly.
I wanted to point out the lovely little description of Nimue here at the beginning of 38. Nimue resolves the crisis of the poisoned apple when she shows up a day late. It so happened that the Patrick accusation was cleared up the next day when Nimue arrived with a second-sighted explanation. Merlin, before letting her lock him up in a cave, had given the matter of Britain into her hands. He had made her promise, it was all that he could do, that she would watch over Arthur herself, now that she knew his own magic. Then he had gone meekly to his imprisonment, casting a last long doting look upon her. Nimue, though scatterbrained and unpunctual, was a good girl in her way. She turned up a day late, told how the apple had come to be poisoned, and went back to her own concerns. That's great.
Whatever they were. I mean, we never find that out.
Right.
Avoiding Merlin.
Some scatterbrained female nonsense, most likely.
Right, of course, yes.
Makeup.
I don't know any other source that says Merlin entrusted Arthur to Nimue's care. I think that's an interesting development.
That's a good point. I can't think of any. She's related to the Lady of the Lake. I think it might be her sister, or cousin, depending on which version of the text you're reading. But whether or not she's been given a special charge by Merlin, I don't think so. Especially because the relationship she has with Merlin at this point in the story is sort of antagonistic. I mean, she's locked him up. They're not off in love. Like when they go to see Lancelot, you get the sense that they're just tooling around in love. But no, she locks him up because he's a sex pest. And, she gets sick of him and tricks him with his own magic and locks him in a cave. And so that's where he is. But she's not with him. She's off doing whatever it was she did before Merlin came along.
Well, White can't have Merlin as a sex pest.
No.
So
well, not the Merlin he's given us, right? It would be absurd.
He has a Merlin who willingly goes into prison after handing the torch over to Nimue.
Well, I'm glad you took us to this chapter because this is where, if I had to put my finger on it, this is where Guinevere starts to come apart. So a message comes from Elaine. And Lancelot is debating whether or not to go to see Elaine. And what's to be done about it, right? Well, Guinevere, immediately her head fills with all sorts of imagined psychotic scenarios in which Lancelot's going to go and fall in love with Elaine and they're going to laugh at her. They're going to laugh and laugh and laugh at her because they're not going to, they'll finally be out from under her and they can tell the truth about how he feels about her, which he doesn't really care for her at all. And, they'll be able to say their prayers together because, of course, Elaine's become a nun and they can devote themselves to their God and they'll never think about her, but also they'll be laughing at her.
It's a beautifully described exchange. He gets the jealousy just exactly right. Lancelot says, "Jenny, couldn't you forgive her? She's probably ugly as well as miserable now. She never had much to fall back on." The generous Lancelot, the sarcasm dripping in her voice. If you don't want me to go, I won't. You know I've never loved any human being except you. Only Arthur. Only Elaine. Only God. Unless there are some others I don't know about.
And how funny is it there that she responds to "I've never loved any human being except you" by listing God among those
Yeah.
Yeah.
beings.
Yeah.
And then Lancelot's response is also perfect. Lancelot shrugged his shoulders. One of the stupidest things to do when the other party wants to have a fight. Exactly right.
Don't do that. I've learned to stop doing that. But what I do now is I look up to the ceiling, and then my wife yells at me for that too. Don't roll your eyes at me. I'm not rolling my eyes. I'm not. And then I roll my eyes at that. I am really in for it. I'm just trying not to say anything is what I'm trying to do. Just please let me have this one little gesture. No. Well, he says he won't go. And then she tells him, you'd better go. Because, the goal, I think, and this is what White gets so well, this is why I think he must have had a fight with his girlfriend at some point, is to trap him, right? Lancelot's not to be allowed to have any sort of way out. Okay, I won't go because you don't want me to go. Well, then you'd better go. You'd better go. Okay, well, I will go. Oh, you want to go then? You see this?
She doesn't want a resolution.
Exactly.
She wants the fight itself. She wants to feel there is a kindred emotion kindled in him to match the upset and dysfunction in her psyche.
Yep.
And he's not taking the bait. He's not getting mad. He's not reaffirming to her that yes, this is something that hurts and you're okay to be mad. He's trying to calm her down, which again, those of us who are married know does not work.
He doesn't appreciate how cathartic it can be to throw a fit together.
Well, yeah, and if one person wants to have a fight, you'll have a fight. Even if you try not to participate. And Lancelot's trying not to participate, and he's being drawn in. And she's just becoming. Notice she just becomes more and more hysterical and angry as it goes along, and it becomes more and more unreasonable. So eventually, he does decide to go, because he ought to. Galahad is Elaine's son, and he's been assumed into heaven, having found the Holy Grail. Oughtn't he tell her about that? Oughtn't he explain to her? He was with Galahad for his last moments. Oughtn't she know about that? I mean, I think those are all perfectly reasonable things. And if Guinevere were a reasonable person, moved by reasonable arguments, then that would have purchase with her. But she's not, and they don't. So he goes in odium, basically. And what happens when he leaves is even worse, because Guinevere really, the fact that he's left is proof of all of her suspicions in her mind.
She met him at the Great Gate.
Oh.
She's waiting. She says, I was waiting for you. She was plump and dumpy now, rather like Queen Victoria. She received him faithfully. He had said that he would come back, and here he was. She had expected nothing else. With her next word, she stabbed him to the heart. You will be staying for good now, she said, hardly a question. It was in this way that she had construed his answer when he parted all that time ago.
Yes. I will come back to you. And she understood that as permanently. And so here he is, and that must be the fulfillment of it. And then we do have in the very next line in the beginning of chapter 39, that thing I mentioned earlier about Mallory being a passionate follower of tournaments, like one of those old gentlemen who nowadays frequent the cricket pavilion at Lord's. Right. And he may have had access to some ancient wisdom, which is the yearly summary of all the cricket, published in little yellow hardcover books. In any case, this is about the tournament at Winchester, which with Sir Lewis is one of the closing tournaments in the Mort. And as White points out, that the importance of the tournament is not in any particular feat of arms. What it is Elaine's conviction that she's going to stay with her and this departure from it. And this is the backdrop of this unfortunate circumstance, right? He's going to wear a favor for Elaine. And Guinevere is off having a conversation with Bors. And once again, White reminds us that Bors is a women hater. And he says here, Bors always had instructive scenes with women, being a woman hater. He said what he thought, and they said what they thought, and neither of them understood the other a bit. Bors noted that the queen was nigh out of her mind for wrath. And this is in response to her saying, "Have ye heard how falsely Sir Lancelot hath betrayed me?" She'd have to be out of her mind with wrath to say such a thing. It's confirmation
Yes.
of her adultery. Why would you say such a thing? Nigh out of her mind.
Well, I think that in a Guinevere is also a narcissist in the sense that the rest of the court, what other people think, what other people do, none of it matters to her at all. It's just her and Lancelot. They're the only real people.
Yeah. Well, one thing I like about this little moment here is it really sums up what Lane said a moment ago, which is that she was going to have her seen. And White says it explicitly. Bors tries to leave. He actually turns his back on the queen. Turning your back on a woman and storming out of the room wasn't the way to carry on, but to do it to the queen, he really has no interest in this. And she goes to grab him, and White says she was going to restrain him by force if necessary. She would have her seen. And she's just becoming more and more outraged. Why should I not call her a traitor? When he has the red sleeve upon his head at Winchester at the Great Juiced. And Bors, afraid that he was going to be physically assaulted, said, "I'm sorry about the sleeve. If he had not worn it as a disguise, perhaps people would not have set upon him 3-1. Fie on him!" exclaimed the queen. "He got a good thrashing anyway, in spite of all his pride and boasting. He was beaten in a fair fight." He was just told it was 3-1, and Bors corrects her. No, it was 3-1. Fie on him! Right. This makes it into Camelot in a song for Mordred and his friends, right? Fie, fie,
yes.
Fie. Fie on goodness. Well, you get some of that here. There's a sort of fie on goodness from Guinevere. I mean, what Lancelot is doing is chivalrous and good. And, it shows he has pity on Elaine. And her response is, fie on it. "I have you for good now," she said radiantly, Elaine. "Elaine," he said, "I want to talk to you." Now I like we get a chapter break there because you can imagine what it's full of. He's going to leave again. It's one of
That's
those
a chapter break designed to keep you to go into the next chapter.
Yeah. And then what happens? Well, in the next chapter, which is only just over a page long, Elaine is dead. It's too much. She thought he was coming back for real, for good, for all. And she says, "Yeah, I have you forever. You won the tournament for me." And nope, now I'm leaving. So she kills herself. And Guinevere, who has just been telling everyone what a betrayer Lancelot is, now remonstrates with him. Says, "Why couldn't you have been nicer to her? Why couldn't you have given her something?" Lancelot doesn't have the weakness of character that would make him reply, because you prohibited me doing so, because you attacked me anytime there was even the slightest hint that I would do anything for her. But it would be perfectly just for him to respond. And Bors might have said so if he were there. But Lancelot just takes it, I think. Says not, or maybe worse, maybe he shrugs, which would be disastrous.
The last sentence, I think, or the last two sentences are worth reading. Guinevere, who did not yet realize that Elaine had come between them more effectively than ever, said this quite spontaneously, and she meant it. She was overwhelmed with pity for her rival in the barge. That's when an emotion is able to surface that was blocked out while Elaine was still alive, because the jealousy was too intense. But now that it's gone, this genuine pity is able to surface.
And I think we also have a little bit of authorial breakthrough here earlier in that paragraph where it says, even if Lancelot was a weak man, or a games maniac, or that infuriating creation, a person who consistently tries to be decent, he does not seem to have had an easy time of it. And so that's White, because White's struggle was always with what he felt defects in his own character, a sadistic streak, uh, trouble in romance and his sexuality, as he said. So here he's saying that the most infuriating creation is a person who consistently tries to be decent but fails at it.
And I think
So
that's
I think we're getting a little of him in Lancelot
more
here.
than a little. I mean, I think that's what he's done with Lancelot, is he's taken a lot of his biographical realities.
And this is why Lancelot is ugly in T.H. White, because this is how White feels about himself.
Which is
How much
strange
better
because
it would be if someone had just told him, like, look, you're doing your best. It's okay. That's all anyone can ask of you.
Yeah.
Go easy on yourself, man.
No one says that to Lancelot, though. Do you notice that? And I think it's because no one thinks they have to. I mean, you don't need to say that to the best knight in the world, surely, right? That's what people think.
Well, the second best knight in the world, according to God.
Well, yes. Well, now the best knight
But
again, because Galahad's
not
gone.
according to the world, which is, I think, the point of why we have this sort of little coda after the Grail chapters. The Grail chapters are God's verdict on Lancelot. Lancelot is second best, Galahad is best. But in these chapters, the sort of ending to the book, we have the world's verdict that Lancelot really is the greatest knight.
Not just the world's verdict, because he does heal Sir Uri, and that's the thing. But before we get to that, we have to mention Meleagant, or Meleagrance, as White has him. So this is the Knight of the Cart, and it's called that sequence because, of course, Lancelot ends up in a cart, whipping a cart horse, which is dragging him along, right? So we have the Knight and the Cart, and the Knight in the Cart is yet another case where Guinevere gets in trouble. And these happen back to back in Mallory. You have the poisoned apple, where she needs a champion to defend her from Sir Mador de la Porte, who charges her with poisoning Sir Gawain. It's a false charge. Bors offers to step in. Lancelot is the one who ultimately does so. He defends her, and Mador yields. Meleagant is a different thing. Meleagant's in love with Guinevere, and he kidnaps her. Abducts her, I should say, and takes her to his grim tower and holds her there. And this plan can only work if nobody gets away, so that nobody can notify anyone where she is. So she'll just disappear and no one will ever find out what happened to Guinevere. It's a mad plan, because eventually, the story's going to get out, and then he's going to be in properly serious trouble. But, he's a mad person, so he doesn't think through things. And in the event someone does escape, and the court is notified, and Lancelot comes riding, as Guinevere knows he would. Hell for leather. As the messenger is still relating the story, Lancelot's already buckled up and ready to go. And he's out the castle straight away. Now, Meleagrance, I should say, knows this, and he ambushes Lancelot and kills Lancelot's horse, which is why Lancelot needs the cart horse and the cart. And nevertheless, he gets there, and what happens? Well, Meleagrance, as we have him in the story, is rather a coward, and he is. That the circumstances of his combat make that clear later on. And he invites Lancelot in, and it's all a trap. And he throws Lancelot in a dungeon. But Lancelot, good with women, gets out of the dungeon. He, entrances his the girl who's sent to keep watch on him. Probably signs an autograph for her. Today he would take a selfie with her, right? Gets out of the prison, and off he goes to get Meleagant. Well, why is it important that he tracks down Meleagant? Well, it's important that he tracks down Meleagant because he does break his faith with God whilst they are all at the castle. And that is that several of the knights were wounded defending Guinevere. And Guinevere, rather craftily, has them housed in a room adjacent to hers. Lancelot sneaks in to the castle in the night to spend time with Guinevere, and he cuts himself on his way into the castle. I think Mallory says he does so on a nail. I can't remember exactly. But in any case, coming into the window, he cuts his hand, and he gets blood all over the sheets, and then he descends without realizing it. And when Meleagant barges in the morning to get Guinevere out of bed, he finds blood all over the sheets, which is, I think, the point in Mallory, and also the point for us now as readers of this. It's clearest to us that they've had sexual relations, right? You could, other places you could probably look around it. Here, it's really like absolutely clear they've had sex. So they're having an adulterous liaison. Meleagant assumes, reasonably, that it's one of the wounded knights from the room next door. And also there are all these rumors about the queen anyway, so this just confirms it. And he is now the jilted lover because he loves her too. So this makes him bold to the point of insanity, and he charges the queen with treason. Despite the fact that he's just abducted her and he's committed a crime himself. He charges her with treason. This has to be answered. And so a champion needs to be found, and Lancelot is going to be the champion again. But this is a very different situation than the poisoned apple. Because in the poisoned apple sequence, the charge was false. Guinevere had not attempted to poison Gawain. And in this case, as White points out, Lancelot knows that the charge is essentially true. Yet it's in the detail. She did not sleep with one of the knights in the adjacent room, but she did sleep with one of Arthur's knights. And that's why there's blood over the sheets. The knight just happens to have been him, and he wasn't in the adjacent room. So it's rules lawyering on this tiny point. But Lancelot knows that the charge is essentially true, that the queen has been untrue to the king, and he still fights in the combat. I think this is a major turning point, and it's why Mallory gives us this story last before the downfall of Camelot. And you see White doing it too. White, I think, has instinctively grasped this. And what happens in the scene that immediately follows, the very last scene, was the healing of Sir Uri. We should point out that Lancelot does beat Sir Meleagant. Unlike Sir Mador de la Porte, he doesn't surrender because he's in love with the queen. He can't surrender. He's mad. And also, Meleagant makes him fight unequal odds because he wants to give up. And there's, I think, a sense in Lancelot he's too dangerous to live, right? And
well,
also,
Guinevere certainly says that. Yeah, she gives the thumbs down.
That's not in Mallory. But I mean, I think that she must think this. Like, he's a real evidentiary witness to their adultery in a way that no one else has been. He's really dangerous. And it's another moment that speaks really badly of Guinevere. I mean, she's basically saying, kill the witness. Kill the witness. She's using her hitman to judicially
because there are no other real people for Guinevere except for her and Lancelot. Everyone else is irrelevant.
But think of it in terms of the conceit of a trial by combat. The trial by combat is supposed to be God's judgment.
Yeah.
Because God will strengthen the arm of the person whose cause is righteous.
Surely Lancelot believes this, right? I mean, Lancelot, who's devoted to God, surely he believes this.
But he tries, I think, by handicapping himself, by saying, I'm not going to wear armor, I'm not going to carry a shield. He is almost testing God at this point, like, look, but it actually makes it worse, not better. It makes it more miraculous.
Yeah.
That he prevails over Meleagant.
Well, I think there's at least a part of Lancelot that wants to lose. So that in his mind,
what he thinks
God's
about
justice
himself.
would finally be done, but he wouldn't be the one responsible for exposing Guinevere, right? Which is what he almost did when he confessed in front of Arthur, and he realized that this is her secret too. I can't unilaterally reveal it. And this would solve the whole problem if he died in this fight.
But it goes the opposite way. It disproves Lancelot's theology.
Yeah.
I note that White says earlier that Lancelot doesn't believe God is some sort of holy bogey who only exists to punish. But here it's almost like God is giving Lancelot and Guinevere grace. They don't deserve it, but no one deserves grace. That's the point of grace. But neither one of them are smart enough to pick up on it.
No. Well, so here's the problem, right? If you're Lancelot and you really believe that God exists and he sets the outcome of trial by combat, you must go into this fight knowing you'll lose. Right? I mean, that, and you don't have to believe in God. You know God exists because you've seen the Holy Grail and you've seen Galad go to heaven and you've been knocked down to the ground by it. So there you go.
And you're madly in love with him.
Yeah, and you're madly in love with him. So you know that he's going to let you die in this judicial combat because the charge is true. The queen has been untrue to the king with one of her knights in Meleagant's castle. And yet, that isn't what happened. And in Mallory, we get a speech from Lancelot defending the queen as well. The queen has not been untrue to you. He does this again later, after he's charged with adultery, having been caught in flagrante delicto in her chambers. He comes before Arthur at the behest of the Pope and says the same thing. There are people in the court who say that the queen has been untrue to you, and I tell you it is not the case. They are liars, right? Well, that's completely false. And you would know because you're the one who's been untrue with her. So how can we have Lancelot, the pinnacle of chivalry, who's also a completely unrepentant liar? And there are two ways of looking at this. So one way is the way that Mark Lambert looks at it. Mark Lambert is a Mallorean scholar who wrote a book called Style and Vision in Le Morte d'Arthur. And he has a whole chapter on this in his book, published in 1979, I think. The year I was born. So it's an old book, but a really, really good one. And he says it's about shame and guilt, right? That there's a dichotomy between shame and guilt. They're not the same thing. Lancelot is interested in shame. He exists in a culture of shame. We tend to exist in a culture of guilt. And we're interested in what can be proved with facts. That's what guilt is, right? Guilt is established by evidence and fact and conformity to what we might call objective reality. That's what guilt is. Shame isn't about that at all. Shame is about what you can bring to bear. And it may be completely opposite to guilt. And Lancelot, knowing that he will absolutely win against anyone in the ring, especially Sir Meleagant, knows that he cannot be shamed. And if you live in a world of shame, where shame is what matters and not guilt, then Lancelot doesn't have to worry about this combat. And in fact, he doesn't have to worry about his speech before the king because nobody can disprove him. Nobody can shame him. And so what he's saying, it isn't necessarily objectively true, but that doesn't matter. That's the wrong measuring stick. Right? That's our measuring stick. Objective truth and guilt. What matters is he shamed or not? Can he be shamed or not? That's what matters. That's the measuring. And the answer is no, he can't be shamed. Now there's another
that
theory.
Dovetails nicely with White's point here about Arthur. The shame is almost part of that might culture.
Yeah.
That Arthur is now trying to get away from and push towards justice. Justice seems very much a guilt culture, not a shame culture.
Because it's abstract, right? It's objective. It's something everybody has access to. So there's another scholar who has written about this and has said that actually what's going on isn't about shame or guilt, although that can be kind of an interesting way of framing it. It's about understanding Lancelot's belief in truth. And that scholar, his name is Sean Philip Cooper, and he's written about this extensively as well. And he says, because Lancelot believes that God can is the arbiter of battles, because he really believes it. And because it's true, actually, in Mallory and in White. The fact that Lancelot goes in there and beats Meleagant makes it true. It is true. As far as anyone is concerned, it's absolutely true. And Lancelot knows it is. So he has truth in himself, like he can make things true. Truth isn't conformity to objective reality. Truth is what you can prove. It's a kind of functional, or maybe a sort of a tool use of truth, right? Is what we can think of it. Truth is is something you can make. And Lancelot knows that. He's the best knight in the world. He can make things true. And that's not remarkable to him at all. And it wouldn't be remarkable to anyone in the court, if that makes sense. So that's my thing. I don't necessarily buy into shame versus guilt as such, but I think truth is more malleable for them.
What is interesting, though, in how White departs from Mallory is that while Mallory is fine making Lancelot a liar for whatever reasons, whether we go with the one scenario, or the
Shame,
other,
guilt,
that you've
whatever.
sketched out here. White's not content with that.
No.
He can only have Lancelot lie by omission, but he will never have him tell an overt lie. So we have a different kind of moral framework in White than we do in Mallory. Whatever Mallory's is, it's not this.
No, that's absolutely right. And I think that's as a sure a sign as any that White is part of our generation. Like to us, having a lying Lancelot is a problem, right? That we can't, we struggle with a text that would have Lancelot be a liar, which is why so many readers reading Mallory struggle with a Lancelot who suddenly seems to be an unrepentant liar, defending first a lying cause and then making a lying speech to the king. How can that be? And that's why we need to deal with it either by explaining it, like with an academic explanation of like, well, actually, our systems of truth are different than the systems of truth in Mallory's time, or by changing the story, which is what White does. Let's just not have that be part of the story. And of course, in The Candle in the Wind, Lancelot never makes that speech. And here, in this particular judicial combat, he gives Lancelot a good deal of interiority about how to do this. And he also makes Meleagant a much more craven figure. So his death is a little more...
not only that, but worse for White, he makes Meleagant's part of a different social class altogether.
That's right.
Which makes him...
Gives him a Cockney accent, does he?
There was a Cockney knight named Sir Meleagant. And no one is actually good in White's story unless they are from upper-class English nobility.
Well, this brings us to
it's RP or nothing.
Well, this brings us to the conclusion of this week's podcast. So now Lancelot has fought in a bad cause and still won, which is a hint that maybe judicial combat isn't quite right in terms of conforming to objective reality, if that's your standard of truth, right? Which is our standard of truth. But then we get the Sir Uri sequence. White drags this out. In Mallory, this is one of those things that in Mallory is a good deal shorter. White really pads it out. I think he does a good job. He uses several chapters to basically lay out Lancelot's extreme reluctance to do this. And Lancelot is indeed, in Mallory, the very last of Arthur's knights to search Uri's wounds. Now, Mallory doesn't give us any interiority about this, but I think that White's creation of it is absolutely reasonable. Lancelot's convinced he's going to fail. And when I teach Mallory, I always go back to the sequence in White because White's psychologization of Lancelot is so good. He talks about basically the feeling you get when everybody is going to know that you're a fraud, the moment it's going to be exposed. Everybody is going to know that you've been with the queen. It's all going to be exposed. This is going to be the thing that does it. He's going to go up. He's going to search Sir Uri's wounds. It's not going to heal him. And that'll be confirmation of everything. Everyone will know why. And it'll also be proof of what you've thought about yourself your whole life, right? About your unfitness. This will prove it. That God has finally and totally turned his back on you, that you can't do miracles, that you're not the best knight in the world, that you're just a fraud. So in a way, Lancelot is facing a sort of death, right? The death of the self, the ego killer, right? He's going to go in there and he's going to be completely exposed and everyone's going to turn their back on him. Now, Arthur points out this is unreasonable. That's not what's going to happen, even if he were to fail. Right? Lancelot would try and it wouldn't work and everybody would just shrug their shoulders and say, okay, well, that's it. We've done our best. But that's not how Lancelot sees it. And I think that's really important. You have to get inside of Lancelot for this sequence to make sense. And that's why when it does work, and he does heal Sir Ure, Lancelot, everyone's jumping around and cheering. And Lancelot, as Mallory says, and White quotes him, wept like a boy who had been beaten. Because of so many different things, right? Because he is the best knight in the world. It's not just what the world thinks, Lane. It's God himself confirms it here. Galahad's gone, so he can be the best knight in the world again. But also, and White doesn't touch on this, but I think it's important, Lancelot knows that as much of a failure as he is, as so riddled with inveterate, irredeemable, irreconcilable, determined, stubborn sin, he keeps going back to it again and again. Even with that, even cheating on the king, his best friend, with his wife, even defending an evil cause and then triumphing and then allowing the triumph to stand. Even with all that, he's still the best knight in the world, which tells you something about the quality of the other knights and the quality of Arthur's court, to which he's devoted his entire life. This is it. I'm as good as they get, and I know how bad I am. That must be part of a very harsh blow, in addition to the gratefulness for God's mercy, grace, charity, whatever you want to call it, that allows him to carry out that healing.
I think Lancelot, to a certain degree, expects the punishment from God. He expects God to deny him the miracle, to make plain the lie, but this is almost as if God is waving all that away and, you know, making the success. It's almost like God is complicit in the deception at this point, in Lancelot's mind. Not that he's receiving grace, not that God is making the point that I will work through an imperfect instrument if I need to. The miracle can flow through anyone. It refutes Lancelot's theology in a way that I don't think Lancelot is prepared to grasp.
Well, look at what Lancelot prays just before the healing happens, and you'll see that the way that White has framed the miracle, it's not really about Lancelot and Guinevere and their guilt or non-guilt at all. It's about something else, and it's in this prayer. Lancelot looked into the east where he thought God lived and said something in his mind. It was more or less like this: I don't want glory, but please can you save our honesty? And if you will heal this knight for the knight's sake, please do. I think it's that particular prayer. Can you save him for his sake? That it's so altruistic, that it's not about the problems that Lancelot and Guinevere are having and their guilt and their shame or whatever. It's, here's a suffering person. Can you heal them for their own sake?
Or even his desire to perform a miracle. That way that confirms him as being the best.
Yeah, that's good.
This is Lancelot stepping back and saying, it's in your hands.
He doesn't want to do it. He has to be commanded to do it. And even when he's commanded to do it by Arthur, Arthur says, I do command you. I do want you to do it. And Lancelot says, okay, but wouldn't it be presumptuous then if I, maybe it would be better if I didn't. He's still trying to read a lot of it. So he really doesn't want to do the miracle. And how different is that from the Lancelot who started the Ill-MadeKnight, who just wanted to do a miracle?
Who wanted to do a miracle for the sake of doing a miracle. Now he wants for this knight to be healed for his own sake.
Yeah.
He doesn't care about doing the miracle. He'd rather not do a miracle. But can you please heal this knight for his sake?
Maybe Guinevere doesn't grow in this book, but Lancelot certainly does.
That is a sign of significant growth, I'd say, right there.
And that's where it ends. He does heal Sir Ure. He does weep like a boy that had been beaten. And that's just where the book ends. We don't know what happens next because, of course, White had certainly intended to write another book after this, 2 more books, in fact. And that's where we're going to start next week with The Candle in the Wind. And this is where Mallory leaves off too, before the final sequence, before the Mort d'Arthur, the death of Arthur, as the final sequence of the Mort d'Arthur is called. And where does it begin? It begins with the two unhappy knights, and they're the ones. Did you notice? I love this detail. It's not in Mallory, but White gives it to us. Lancelot goes to heal Sir Uri, and Agravain and Mordred step forward. They're waiting. They're waiting for him to fail. So there's a certain truth to Lancelot's fears, because they're waiting to accuse him. Say, oh, the reason you can't do it is because you're with the queen. This will be evidence. And then they'll gloat and they'll strut and preen in a way which they otherwise could not. Well, that's not how it transpires. Not this week, at least. But next week, things will be different. So do tune in for the first of our, what do we have? 4 more episodes on The Once and Future King by T.H. White. If you've enjoyed this podcast, you might want to support it by going to criticalreadings.com and clicking Become a Patron at the top of the page. Then you can watch the podcast as it's being recorded live, or listen to it live if you prefer. You also get early access to the podcast as soon as it's edited, and you can participate in discussions on our discussion forums and in our chat rooms with our listeners. Please do join us. We'd love to have you on our Discord as a patron. And thank you especially this week to our co-hosts. They are Dr. Drew Nathaniel Keene.
It's been a pleasure.
And Lane Haygood.
Goodbye, as always.
We'll be back next week with the first part of The Candle in the Wind from The Once and Future King by T.H. White. Until then, from all of us here at Critical Readings, Godspeed.